Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's no question that this has been a challenging budget and that many very difficult decisions have been made that each of us has been heavy-hearted about, especially in those areas where the result has been the loss of jobs. But I want to challenge the disturbingly inaccurate characterizations which have been made by members opposite over the past number of weeks and increasingly over the last number of days. Mr. Speaker, on Budget Day, in front of a packed gallery, we heard the Leader of the Opposition say, and I quote, that we blew through the savings. The finance critic in her response said that, and again I quote, we arrogantly and recklessly spent. And even more offensively, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition last Thursday said our government has, and I quote, a deficit of decency. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if a deficit of decency means increasing the social services budget, a budget which helps the most vulnerable people in our society, to a record level at a time when we have had a $1.2 billion drop in revenues over the last 3 years. Hear, hear, hear. I wonder if we were being arrogant and reckless when we introduced the SED program in 2009. Hear, hear. When we've, across all of our ministries, invested $3.7 billion to help people with disabilities, and have effectively eliminated the 440 waitlist generated by decades of neglect by the former government. Hear, hear, hear. Merv Bender, the chair of the Program Implementation Advisory Committee team, remarked just on Budget Day, I am very pleased that government is continuing its commitment to the program with a $16 million increase to the SED budget for next year. It is especially meaningful in a challenging financial situation that the province chose to make this investment in support of people with significant and enduring disabilities. I wonder if our arrogance and recklessness is demonstrated by a person-centred process to transition people from the institutionalized setting at Valley View Centre into communities where individuals have the opportunity to be included as citizens, and whereas we, as citizens, have the opportunity to meet, interact with, and hopefully make friends with neighbours who have physical and mental challenges. This work continues to be supported in this budget. Mr. Speaker, I've sat in this House and listened to almost every budget since 2007, and over the years, I've been shocked at just how much this government has invested in helping vulnerable people. Those vulnerable people have included families of children with autism, or women fleeing domestic violence who are in need of shelter, low-income seniors, and people who are at risk of homelessness. These investments in year after year after year have been made to support people who are struggling, Mr. Speaker. Yet day after day after day, we hear about our reckless spending or our mismanagement and waste. I guess we differ here, Mr. Speaker. I don't think it's been a waste to support people with disabilities. Hear, hear. I'm proud of the 2009 creation of the SED program. The NDP record on supporting people with disabilities was that, well, they just didn't. They let people languish on a wait list. It must not have been a priority, which is why I guess they characterize decisions like this as reckless and arrogant when they talk about our spending during the so-called boom years. But I guess what is most frustrating, Mr. Speaker, is that the members opposite speak from both sides of their mouth. What? On the one hand, our spending over the years, much of the investments in services, benefits and supports for people in the Ministry of Social Services has been in part of a record that, according to them, is characterized by mismanagement and waste. And then, almost in the same sentence sometimes, Mr. Speaker, the same member or one of their colleagues will follow up by saying, we've made callous cuts, or we make the most vulnerable pay. And then after that, Mr. Speaker, the finance critic or the Leader of the Opposition will talk about deficits. Well, which is it, Mr. Speaker? Yeah, which is it? Anyone with even the most rudimentary level of basic economics knows you can't simultaneously criticize too many investments, not enough investments, and running a deficit.
But they're very good in opposition.
And now,
they need to stay there.
And now remember, Mr. Speaker, that I'm speaking largely of the Ministry of Social Services. But this problem is even more pronounced when members get up to petition for an infrastructure project like a bridge and then turn around and call the largest infrastructure investment in the history of our province, which is creating thousands of jobs, an example of scandal, mismanagement and waste. I think we can all agree, Mr. Speaker, that these arguments are completely incoherent. And it might be because of the fact that outside of providing criticisms of us on absolutely everything, even if those criticisms contradict each other, Mr. Speaker, they have absolutely no plan of their own.
No plans.
And as was duly noted by the member of Martensville earlier, this is not what we should see by a so-called government in waiting, Mr. Speaker. We have a plan, Mr. Speaker. We have a plan as a government to manage economy and get back to balance in 3 years. And get this, while there have been some very, very difficult decisions in this budget, and even in the Ministry of Social Services, our government has continued to support people who are vulnerable.
Hear, 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 hear.
The Ministry of Social Services has its largest budget to date, Mr. Speaker. Our income assistance area saw a 13% increase. Our disabilities programs have gone up by 7.6%, and child and family program areas have gone up by 5.5%. These increases, Mr. Speaker, are there to make sure people who are struggling continue to get supported. You know, Mr. Speaker, the member from Saskatoon-Meewasin has talked a lot in his former life about housing and homelessness. For example, in an op-ed piece in the Huffington Post last year, the member for Saskatoon-Meewasin argued that, and I quote, "The most pressing problem, finding stable housing for those who are currently homeless or at risk of homelessness, is one that fortunately can be solved. We need to start collecting real-time, person-specific data on homelessness and expanding the application of the Housing First model of supportive housing for individuals with greater challenges. Housing First is an evidence-based approach to ending homelessness that provides direct access to permanent housing and support." End quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, instead of just talking about this, we're actually doing it. Through the Saskatchewan Housing Corporation, we have provided $50,000 to the United Way to assist with tracking and monitoring the effectiveness of Housing First through Journey Home in Saskatoon.
Hear, hear.
We've invested $60 million to develop 634 units for those who are homeless or at risk of homelessness since we formed government. 496 of those are completed right now, and another 138 are under construction.
Hear, 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 hear.
352 of those, Mr. Speaker, are aimed at those who are specifically hard to house. Mr. Speaker, our average investment in hard-to-house units for people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness since forming government has been about 70 per year. And we are committed to continuing that work. To that end, we've been working at the FPT tables to emphasize the importance of investments like this. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't really like to go back in time, but I think it speaks volumes when I look at NDP investments in hard-to-house units. For a political party that prides itself on standing up for people who are vulnerable, Mr. Speaker, I find it rather surprising that they built 12, that's right, just 12 new hard-to-house units in the last 6 years in office. That's an average of 2 per year, Mr. Speaker.
Great job. That's a horrible
We've invested 70 per year, Mr.
Now,
Speaker.
Paul, left,
It is part
heartless.
of our reckless and arrogant characterization of our government spending plan over the last 10 years. Mr. Speaker, we don't just talk about helping people, we actually do it. And while I am ever mindful that there's always more work to do, I'm comforted by two things, Mr. Speaker. One is that I said we have a plan to grow our economy and get back to balance in 3 years. And two, Mr. Speaker, is that this is actually in line with the poverty reduction strategy, whose very first lines on page 6 of the document state, and I quote, "Our government recognizes that first and foremost, to reduce poverty in our province, the economy must be strong."
Hear,
End
hear,
quote.
hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it is so obvious that it shouldn't need repeating. But given the trajectory of the narrative I have witnessed since I've had the privilege of sitting in this Assembly, it needs to be emphasized that creating jobs, expanding the tax base, and growing the economy by fostering the conditions for investment enables us to pay for the services, programs, and benefits that people enjoy in health, social services, and education. These three areas, Mr. Speaker, consume 70% of our provincial budget. 70%, Mr. Speaker. Our job creation record has consistently been one of the best, if not the best, in Canada, Mr. Speaker. We've had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country, despite the economic challenges that we face. We've grown the population to where it now sits at $1.13 million. We are the most attractive mining jurisdiction in the world, Mr. Speaker. We enjoy a AAA credit rating. We have the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio in the country. In addition to all of these investments I've already identified and more, Mr. Speaker, all these positive economic outcomes have enabled us to remove 112,000 low-income people off the tax rolls. In this budget, we have seen the Saskatchewan low-income tax credit enhanced so as to mitigate the impact of others' tax changes. I submit, Mr. Speaker, that those are not examples of callousness, recklessness, or arrogance. The point, Mr. Speaker, is that there's a very important relationship, a very important and I think underappreciated relationship between our economic management and the services we provide for people. And, Mr. Speaker, if we want to know what those impacts would be with a different economic management plan, we just need to look next door in Alberta. We have our very own case study right next door. We have both relied on natural resource revenue, which has created challenges for us both. However, that is where the similarities end, Mr. Speaker. They support carbon tax. We don't. They don't have a plan to get back to balance and are just kicking the can down the road. We have a plan to get back to balance in 3 years. And what are the results? Alberta's unemployment rate was 7.9% in 2016 and is already at 8.3% in 2017. This places it among one of the highest in the country and above the national average, Mr. Speaker. By contrast, Saskatchewan's unemployment rate was 6%, one of the lowest in Canada. And while nearly every other province in Canada posted increases in average weekly earnings, Alberta's dropped by 1%. In Saskatchewan, our average weekly earnings, Mr. Speaker, increased by 1.8%. Considering this abysmal employment and earnings numbers, Mr. Speaker, I'm shocked to see that the Alberta budget includes a mere 2.2% growth in operating for ministries like social services. How can a so-called socially democratic government have only a 2.2% increase in income supports at a time when it is clearly evident that more people will need them? This cannot come even close to meeting the utilization pressures in that province. They've also drained their contingency plan to cover operating, and unlike our government, they haven't built one in to cover unexpected changes in utilization, not in 17-18, not in 18-19, and not in 19-20, Mr. Speaker.
Shame.
I am not making this up.
Shame.
The case study for what happens when you don't have a sound economic management plan, or frankly, any plan at all, is right next door, Mr. Speaker. And it doesn't look very good. Not for employment, not for the economy, not for deficit management, and certainly not for vulnerable people. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, I am proud to support the good work of the Finance Minister and his team, and seconded by the member from Moosomin. I will be supporting this budget. Thank you.